"Pick it up or get out," Daniel Whitmore said, flicking the loose change from his palm like it didn't belong to anyone. The coins scattering across the polished hardwood floor with a sharp metallic clatter that cut through the low hum of dinner conversation and left the room suspended in a strange, uncomfortable stillness. A few heads turned, then more, until nearly every table in the restaurant had gone quiet. The soft glow of warm pendant lights reflecting off the spinning quarters as they rolled in uneven circles before settling near the edge of a man's worn leather shoes. Shoes that looked like they had walked more miles than anyone in that room cared to imagine. And for a moment, no one moved. Not the waitstaff frozen mid-step with trays hovering in the air. Not the couple by the window who had been laughing seconds before. Not even the hostess near the front who suddenly found something very urgent to look at on her tablet. Because everyone could feel it, that subtle shift in the air when something crosses the line from awkward to wrong. The man standing in front of Daniel didn't bend down, didn't flinch, didn't even glance at the coins at first. Instead, he lifted his eyes slowly, calm and steady, meeting the manager's gaze without a trace of anger. And that alone seemed to irritate Daniel more than any argument could have, because he was used to reactions, to apologies, to people shrinking under the weight of his authority. But this man, this quiet, composed stranger in a faded jacket, just stood there like he had nowhere else to be and nothing to prove. "You heard me," Daniel added, his voice tightening just enough to carry across the room, as if he needed the audience now, needed them to witness the hierarchy he controlled. "We don't run a charity here." And a faint ripple of uneasy laughter came from somewhere near the bar, quickly swallowed by the heavy silence that followed. The man finally looked down, not at the coins, but at the floor itself, as though studying the reflection of the lights in the wood. And when he spoke, his voice was low, measured, almost thoughtful. "Is this how you treat every guest?" The question didn't rise, didn't challenge. It simply existed in the space between them, and somehow that made it heavier, made it linger longer than it should have, because it wasn't just directed at Daniel. It was directed at everyone watching, everyone pretending not to see. Daniel let out a short, dismissive laugh, shaking his head as if the question itself was absurd. "You're not a guest," he replied, each word clipped, precise. "Guests pay." And he gestured vaguely toward the coins on the floor, as if they proved his point, as if they defined the man standing in front of him. Somewhere in the background, a glass clinked softly against a plate, the only sound brave enough to break through the tension. And still, the man didn't move, didn't reach for the money, didn't step back. He simply stood there, shoulders relaxed, eyes steady, taking in the room, the people, the silence that had settled like dust over everything. And for a brief second, something almost imperceptible shifted in his expression. Not anger, not embarrassment, but something quieter, something like understanding, as if he had just confirmed something he already suspected. And Daniel, sensing that shift without knowing why, straightened slightly, his jaw tightening, his confidence just a fraction less certain than it had been a moment ago, because the longer the man remained still, the louder the silence became, and in that silence, the sound of those coins lying untouched on the floor seemed to echo far beyond their small, metallic weight. Marcus Reed let the silence stretch just a second longer before he finally shifted his weight, the faint creak of the wooden floor beneath his shoes sounding louder than it should have, as if the room itself was listening for what he would do next. And instead of reaching for the scattered coins, he glanced briefly toward a nearby table where an elderly woman had dropped a folded napkin without noticing, the cloth resting half on the edge of her plate, threatening to fall, and without a word. Marcus stepped past the coins, bent down, and gently picked up the napkin, smoothing it once between his fingers before placing it neatly back beside her glass. His movement calm, unhurried, almost routine, and the woman blinked in quiet surprise, offering a soft thank you that barely rose above a whisper. But Marcus simply nodded, his expression unchanged, as if kindness required no acknowledgement. Behind him, Daniel exhaled sharply, the sound edged with impatience. "We are not doing this," he muttered louder now, drawing the attention he seemed to crave, his polished shoes stepping forward until they stopped inches from the nearest coin, his presence looming in a way that was meant to reassert control, to remind everyone watching exactly who ran this place. "You think this is some kind of show?" he added, his voice carrying across the dining room, and a few customers shifted in their seats, uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene, while a young server near the kitchen doorway hesitated, gripping her order pad tighter than necessary, her eyes flicking between Marcus and Daniel as if she knew something was wrong but could not say it out loud. Marcus turned back slowly, his gaze settling once again on Daniel, steady and unshaken, and for a moment, neither man spoke, the tension between them tightening like a drawn line that no one dared to cross, until Daniel broke it with a short, dismissive laugh. "Security is right around the corner," he said, tilting his head slightly toward the front entrance. "So you can either pick up your change or you can leave with nothing." And the words hung in the air, heavier now, sharper, because they were no longer just about money. They were about control, about drawing a line in front of everyone and forcing a choice. Marcus looked down then, not hurried, not embarrassed, just deliberate, his eyes following the faint reflections of the overhead lights shimmering across the metal surfaces of the coins, and slowly, he crouched, the movement causing a subtle ripple through the room as a few people leaned forward without realizing it, expecting compliance, expecting the moment to resolve itself in the way these moments usually did. But instead of reaching for the nearest coin, Marcus extended his hand slightly to the side, brushing his fingers along the inside of his jacket pocket, and when he withdrew them, there was no coin between them, only a small, flat object that caught the light differently, a muted metallic sheen that did not belong to loose change, and he held it loosely at his side, not presenting it yet, not explaining it, just letting it exist there in the quiet space between breaths. While Daniel's eyes narrowed for the briefest second, something flickering across his expression that he could not quite name, because the room had shifted again, subtly but unmistakably, and even though nothing had been said, even though no one understood what was about to happen, the silence no longer felt the same. It felt like the moment just before something reveals itself. The object in Marcus Reed's hand did not move, yet it seemed to pull the attention of the entire room toward it, a quiet gravity that no one could explain, and for a moment, even the faint clinking from the kitchen faded into the background, as if the building itself had paused to listen, while Daniel Whitmore's posture stiffened just slightly, his confidence no longer effortless but forced, like a man holding a position he suddenly was not certain he deserved. "What is that supposed to be?" Daniel asked, his tone sharper now, less controlled than before, and a few guests leaned in subtly, drawn not by the words but by the tension threaded through them. Marcus did not answer right away. Instead, he turned the small metal piece between his fingers, letting the overhead light catch along its edge, revealing a brushed surface, clean and deliberate, not something that belonged in a pocket full of loose change. And then, with the same calm precision he had shown from the start, he lifted it slightly, not high enough to display, not low enough to hide, just enough to acknowledge its presence. And that was when a server near the far end of the dining room froze mid-step, her eyes narrowing as she tried to focus on the object from a distance, her breath catching in a way she did not expect, because she had seen something like it before, though not up close, not in someone's hand like this. Daniel noticed the shift, the hesitation in his staff, and it unsettled him more than he cared to admit. "I asked you a question," he pressed, stepping closer, his voice firm but no longer carrying the same easy authority, because something in the room had begun to slip beyond his control, something subtle but undeniable. Marcus finally met his gaze again, his expression unchanged, steady, composed, and when he spoke, his voice remained low, almost reflective. "You said guests pay," he repeated, not arguing, not challenging, simply placing the words back into the space between them. And then he tilted the object slightly, so the engraving caught the light for just a fraction of a second, not long enough for everyone to read, but long enough for someone to recognize. And that someone was the assistant manager standing near the bar, a man named Eric Collins, who had spent the last 3 years memorizing every protocol, every badge, every access credential that mattered in the building. And the moment his eyes landed on that small piece of metal, his expression changed completely, the color draining from his face as recognition struck like a quiet shock. Because the engraving was unmistakable, the design not decorative but official, a symbol reserved for one role, and one role only. And it did not belong to a guest. It did not belong to staff. It belonged to the person whose name had been circulating in emails all morning, the one scheduled to arrive unannounced, the one no one had seen before. Eric took a step forward without realizing it, his voice barely forming at first. "Sir," he began, then stopped, swallowing hard as his eyes flicked from the object to Marcus's face, trying to reconcile the image in front of him with everything he had assumed just minutes ago. And Daniel, hearing the uncertainty in his tone, turned sharply toward him, irritation flashing across his features. "What?" he demanded, but Eric did not answer right away, because in that moment, the truth was not something you said quickly. It was something that settled slowly, heavily, until it could no longer be ignored. And as Marcus lowered his hand again, the metal catching one last glint of light before resting at his side, the silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was defined, clear, and waiting for Daniel to understand exactly what he had just done. Daniel Whitmore did not like the way the room had gone quiet. Not this kind of quiet, not the kind that did not respond to his voice. And he turned back toward Marcus Reed with a tighter jaw, as if force alone could restore the balance he had just lost. "If this is some kind of trick, it is not going to work," he said, each word measured but edged with something less certain than before. While behind him, Eric Collins took another step forward, slower this time, careful, as if approaching something fragile that could shatter if handled wrong. His eyes still locked on the small metal badge resting at Marcus's side, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried just enough to reach Daniel, but not enough to disrupt the room. "Sir, I think you should take a closer look," he said, and that hesitation, that choice of words, was not lost on anyone nearby. Daniel exhaled sharply, irritation flashing again, but it did not land the same way it had before, because now there was doubt beneath it, thin but undeniable, and he reached out, not fully, just enough to gesture toward Marcus's hand. "Then show me," he said, trying to sound in control, trying to make it seem like this moment belonged to him. But Marcus did not rush, did not react to the command. Instead, he simply lifted the badge once more, steady, deliberate, allowing the light above to fall cleanly across its surface. And this time, the engraving held just long enough for Daniel to read it, not all at once, but in pieces, letters forming meaning slower than his mind wanted to accept. And as the realization began to settle, it did not arrive like a shock, it arrived like a weight, pressing down quietly, steadily, until it could not be ignored. Across the dining room, a few whispers began, low and uncertain, not gossip, not yet, just fragments of understanding moving from one table to the next, while the server by the kitchen lowered her tray slightly, her hands no longer trembling from fear, but from something else entirely, something closer to disbelief. Daniel's posture shifted, subtle but visible, his shoulders no longer squared with the same certainty, his stance no longer anchored in authority, and for the first time since the moment began, he did not speak immediately, because the words he had relied on, the tone he had used, no longer fit the reality in front of him, and Marcus, still calm, still composed, lowered the badge back to his side, not as a gesture of power, not as a statement, but as if it had already said everything it needed to say. Eric cleared his throat softly, stepping closer now, his voice steadier, more certain. "We received the notice this morning," he said, addressing Daniel but not looking at him. "The new owner was arriving today, unannounced." And the final word lingered, heavier than the rest, because it explained everything without excusing anything, and Daniel's gaze dropped, not fully, just enough to break the direct line he had held with Marcus, as if eye contact itself had become difficult to maintain. The coins were still there on the floor, scattered, unmoved, catching the same warm light they had from the beginning. But now they looked different, not like something worthless, not like something to be dismissed, but like evidence, small and undeniable, of a moment that had already passed and could not be undone. And as the silence settled again, it was no longer uncertain, no longer waiting. It was resolved, leaving only one question hanging in the air, not spoken, but understood by everyone in the room. What happens next when the man you tried to remove is the one who owns the door? Daniel Whitmore felt it before he fully understood it. That subtle collapse of control that did not happen all at once, but but in quiet, irreversible pieces, like a structure giving way beneath its own weight. And he stood there for a moment longer than he should have, his eyes no longer fixed on Marcus Reed, but drifting, unfocused, as if searching the room for something that could restore the balance he had lost. But there was nothing to find, only the same faces that had been there before, now, watching him differently, not with respect, not even with fear, but with a kind of measured distance, as if they were seeing him clearly for the first time. He cleared his throat, the sound dry, uncertain, and finally looked back at Marcus, really looked this time, not at the jacket, not at the worn shoes, but at the man standing inside them. And the shift was undeniable, because Marcus had not changed, not in posture, not in tone, not in presence. He had been the same from the beginning, calm, steady, composed. And it was Daniel who had misread the entire moment. Daniel started, but the word did not carry. It faltered halfway between intention and reality, and he paused, his jaw tightening slightly, as if forcing himself to continue. "I was not aware," he said finally, each word chosen carefully, as though precision could repair what had already been done. But even as he spoke, he seemed to realize that the sentence itself revealed the problem, not solved it, because respect that depends on awareness is not respect at all. Marcus did not interrupt, did not react. He simply stood there, listening, his expression unchanged, his silence more present than any response could have been. And that silence pressed against Daniel's words, making them feel smaller, less certain. Eric shifted beside them, his posture straight but restrained, as if he understood that this was no longer about policy or protocol. This was something else entirely, something that could not be corrected with procedure, and the staff nearby seemed to sense it too. Their movements slower now, quieter, as though the entire restaurant had entered a space where normal rhythm no longer applied. Daniel's gaze dropped again, this time not out of hesitation but out of recognition, his eyes landing on the scattered coins still resting on the floor between them, their dull shine catching the same warm light, unchanged, unmoved. And for a moment, he stared at them as if they held the answer, as if somehow they could be gathered, erased, undone. But they remained exactly where they had fallen, simple, undeniable, and suddenly, they did not look like currency at all. They looked like a reflection, small pieces of a moment that had already defined him. He took a breath, slower this time, steadier, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost its edge entirely, replaced by something quieter, something closer to honesty. "That should not have happened," he said, not as a defense, not as an excuse, but as a statement he could no longer avoid. And even then, the words felt insufficient, incomplete, because they addressed the action, but not the reason behind it. Marcus finally shifted, just slightly, his eyes lowering once more to the coins before lifting back to Daniel. And when he spoke, his voice remained calm, unchanged. "It did," he said simply, and the weight of that truth settled into the space between them, heavier than any accusation, because it did not argue, it did not accuse, it simply existed, leaving no room for denial, no room for distance, only the quiet reality of what had already taken place. The words settled into the space like something heavier than sound, and for a long moment, no one moved, not the servers, not the guests, not even the quiet hum from the kitchen seemed to carry the same energy anymore, as if the entire room had shifted into a slower rhythm where every breath, every glance, every small movement mattered more than it should. And Marcus Reed stood at the center of it without trying to be, his posture unchanged, his presence steady in a way that did not demand attention but held it anyway. Daniel Whitmore remained where he was, his hands no longer gesturing, no longer commanding, just resting at his sides as though he had forgotten what to do with them, and his eyes drifted again to the floor, to the coins that had not moved since they fell, their edges catching the soft amber light from above, reflecting something quiet and uncomfortable back at him, something that did not fade no matter how long he looked away. A faint sound came from the far corner, a chair shifting slightly as someone adjusted their seat, and it broke the stillness just enough to remind everyone that time had not stopped, even if it felt like it had. And Marcus finally took a slow breath, subtle but visible, his shoulders rising just slightly before settling again. And when he spoke, his voice did not rise to fill the room, It stayed low, measured, meant for Daniel, but heard by everyone anyway. "Do you know what you saw when I walked in?" he asked, not accusing, not challenging, just asking. And Daniel blinked once, caught off guard by the question, because it was not the kind of question he expected, not here, not now. And he did not answer right away, his mind searching for something that felt safe, something that would not make this worse, but nothing came. Marcus continued, his tone unchanged. "You saw what you decided I was worth," he said, and the sentence did not land like an attack. It landed like a reflection, clear and unavoidable, and Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in recognition, because the truth in those words did not need to be argued. It was already visible in the space between them. Near the bar, Eric lowered his gaze, his earlier certainty replaced by something quieter, something closer to discomfort, as if he too was being asked the same question without being addressed directly. And across the dining room, a few guests shifted again, their attention no longer fixed on the confrontation itself, but on what it revealed, something deeper than a single moment, something that extended beyond the walls of the restaurant. Marcus let the silence return for a second, not as a pause, but as part of what he was saying, as if the quiet itself carried meaning. And then he added, "And that does not change depending on who I am." His words steady, deliberate, not raised, not softened, simply placed where they could not be ignored, and the weight of them settled over the room in a way that felt different from before, not tense, not uncertain, but still, like the air after something important has already happened and cannot be undone. Daniel's shoulders lowered just slightly, the tension that had been holding them in place easing without his permission, and for the first time, he did not look like a manager standing in control of a room. He looked like a man standing in front of a truth he could not redirect, and the coins remained where they were, small, unchanged, yet somehow louder now than any voice in the room, their quiet presence marking the exact point where everything had shifted. The silence did not break this time. It deepened, settling into the room like something permanent, something that had moved past discomfort into understanding, and Daniel Whitmore felt it in a way that was impossible to ignore, not as pressure from the people around him, but as something internal, something that had shifted the way the moment existed in his own mind. And for the first time since the coins hit the floor, he was no longer thinking about control, about authority, about being right. He was thinking about what he had actually done, stripped of context, stripped of assumption, reduced to its simplest form, and it did not look the same anymore. He took a slow breath, the kind that does not fix anything but makes space for what comes next, and when he lifted his head again, his eyes did not search for support. They returned directly to Marcus Reed, steady but different now, no longer guarded, no longer defensive, just present. "You are right," he said, and the words came out, quieter than anything he had said before, not weak, but unprotected, and that alone shifted something in the room, because it was not an excuse, not a correction, it was acknowledgement. A faint movement came from the staff behind him, a subtle straightening, a shift in posture, as if they were witnessing something they had not expected to see, and Eric Collins exhaled. Slowly, his shoulders easing just slightly, because this was no longer about recognition, it was about response. Daniel glanced once more at the coins, then back at Marcus, and this time, when he spoke, his voice carried no edge at all. "I made a judgment before I had the right to." He continued, each word deliberate, as if he needed to hear them as much as anyone else did, and the admission did not come easily. It moved through him slowly, but once spoken, it did not retreat. Marcus remained still, listening, his expression unchanged, not approving, not rejecting, simply allowing the words to exist, and that silence again became part of the exchange, not empty, but full, holding space for what Daniel was beginning to understand. "And I treated you based on that," Daniel added, his gaze steady now, not avoiding, not deflecting, and the honesty in that sentence carried more weight than any defense could have, because it did not try to soften the truth, it did not try to reshape it. It simply placed it where it belonged. A soft clink echoed faintly as one of the coins shifted slightly under the movement of air, the small sound drawing attention back to the floor for just a moment, and Daniel noticed it, his eyes following the motion, and then, without thinking about who was watching, Without considering how it might look, he stepped forward and slowly crouched down, his movement careful, almost deliberate, and reached for the nearest coin, lifting it from the floor with a quiet precision that mirrored the moment itself. He did not rush, did not gather them all at once. He picked up one, then another, placing them gently into his palm, as if the act itself mattered more than the result, as if this was not about cleaning the floor, but about acknowledging what had happened on it. And when he stood again, the coins resting loosely in his hand, he did not offer them back immediately. He simply held them there, his gaze returning to Marcus, waiting, not for permission, but for understanding, because the shift had already happened, and everyone in the room could feel it, the moment where authority had given way to accountability, and something quieter, something more human, had taken its place. Marcus Reed looked at the coins resting in Daniel Whitmore's open palm, his gaze steady, not drawn to the metal itself, but to the gesture behind it. And for a moment, he did not move, allowing the weight of what had just happened to remain exactly where it was, visible, undeniable, and the room held that stillness with him, every table, every quiet observer, as if no one wanted to interrupt what this moment had become. Then Marcus took a slow step forward, not closing the distance completely, just enough to acknowledge the space between them, and when he spoke, his voice carried the same calm clarity it had from the beginning. "Those are not mine anymore," he said, not dismissive, not cold, simply stating something that had already changed, and Daniel's fingers tightened slightly around the coins, not in resistance, but in realization, because the meaning of them had shifted beyond their value, beyond their purpose, into something that could not be returned so easily. A faint breath moved through the room, almost collective, as if people had been holding it without knowing, and Marcus continued, his eyes lifting briefly to the staff standing nearby, then back to Daniel. "But this is not about the coins," he added, his tone steady, deliberate. "It is about how this place treats people who walk through that door." And his gaze moved, just for a second, toward the entrance at the far end of the restaurant, where the glass reflected the soft evening light from outside, the threshold that separated expectation from experience. Daniel followed that glance, instinctively, his mind catching up with the shift in focus, and he nodded once, slowly, the movement not forced this time, not reactive, but understood, because what Marcus was pointing to was larger than the moment, larger than the mistake. It was the pattern behind it. Marcus let the silence return again, not empty, but full, giving space for the words to settle, and then he said, "If I had picked those up, nothing would have changed." And the simplicity of that statement carried more weight than anything raised in anger ever could, because it revealed the truth beneath the action, the invisible line that had been drawn long before the coins hit the floor. Daniel lowered his hand slightly, the coin still resting in his palm, but his posture no longer defensive, no longer uncertain, just open, and for the first time, he did not look like someone trying to fix a mistake quickly. He looked like someone trying to understand it completely, and that shift did not go unnoticed, not by the staff, not by the guests, not by Marcus. Eric took a quiet step back, giving space without being told, his earlier tension replaced by something more grounded, something that suggested this moment no longer needed intervention, only continuation. Marcus exhaled softly, almost imperceptible, and then added, "So the question is not what you do with those," his eyes briefly acknowledging the coins in Daniel's hand. "It is what you do next." And the words did not land as a challenge. They landed as an opening, a moment where choice mattered more than authority, where response mattered more than position, and Daniel stood there with that understanding settling into him. The room watching not with anticipation now, but with quiet attention, because whatever came next would not erase what had happened, but it would define what it meant, and in that space, with the coin still resting between them as a reminder, the moment held steady, waiting not for reaction, but for something real. Daniel Whitmore stood with the coins still resting in his palm, their faint metallic edges pressing lightly against his skin as if reminding him that this moment, this exact point in time, was not something he could move past without choosing what it meant. And for a second longer, he did not speak, not because he did not have words, but because the words that mattered could not be rushed. They had to come from a place he had not reached before, a place that did not rely on authority or habit, but on something quieter, something more deliberate. He closed his fingers slowly around the coins, not hiding them, not gripping them tightly, just holding them with intention. And then he turned, not toward Marcus first, but toward the staff, toward the people who had watched everything unfold without saying a word. And when he spoke, his voice carried differently now, not projecting, not commanding, but clear enough to reach every corner of the room. Everyone here deserves to be treated with respect the moment they walk through that door, he said, and the sentence did not feel like policy. It felt like acknowledgement, like something being set in place for the first time instead of repeated out of routine. A quiet shift moved through the staff, subtle but real, shoulders straightening, eyes lifting, not out of fear but out of recognition, as if the space itself had been redefined in a way they could feel. Daniel paused, just briefly, then looked back at Marcus Reed, his gaze steady, no longer searching, no longer uncertain. That includes you, he added, and there was no hesitation in it, no condition, just a simple, direct statement that carried more weight than anything he had said before. Marcus met. His eyes, the same calm presence he had held from the beginning, still there, unchanged, and for a moment, neither man moved. The space between them no longer tense, no longer divided, just quiet, as if something had finally settled into place. Daniel then stepped forward once more, but this time not to assert, not to correct, only to act, and he moved past Marcus toward the nearest table, placing the coins gently on its surface, not returning them, not discarding them, simply setting them down, where they no longer defined anyone, where they were just what they were, small pieces of metal without meaning. The gesture was simple, almost unnoticeable, but it carried a quiet finality, a way of closing the moment without pretending it had not happened. Marcus watched, his expression steady, and then he gave a small nod, not approval, not forgiveness spoken out loud, just recognition, the kind that does not need explanation. And with that, he turned slightly, his gaze moving across the restaurant one last time, taking in the room, the people, the space that now felt different from when he had first walked in. The soft glow of the lights reflected across the polished floor, no longer highlighting scattered coins, no longer marking a moment of division, just illuminating a quiet, steady space where something had shifted beneath the surface. Marcus began to walk, not hurried, not delayed, just moving forward with the same calm presence he had carried from the start, his steps measured, his posture unchanged, and as he passed the entrance, the glass door catching the reflection of the room behind him, the silence that remained was not empty. It was full, holding the weight of what had been seen, what had been understood, and what would not be forgotten. And in that silence, no one spoke, because nothing more needed to be said.